Hello, QVS APUS history students. I would like to welcome you to week 2 of Essential Unit 2. And we will discuss in this video today what your responsibilities are for this week. And I'm also going to take you to an outside PowerPoint so that I can kind of like explain some of the most important foundational pieces of history, especially as it relates to American colonial history. So let me start by taking you to the course page and walking you through what you need to do in week 2. And then I'll again take you to that outside PowerPoint to introduce to you the different colonial regions. So let's go ahead and get started. So last week when we were starting Unit 2, I already introduced to you the unit map. Hopefully you've listened to the video that is behind the map. When clicking upon it, you work through the week 1 activities, and by this point in time, the expectation is that you move on to week 2. In week 1, you looked at some of the motivations for colonization. You looked at the first permanent settlement and some of the struggles that they faced in Jamestown. And you also then had to consider, if you had the choice between moving to Jamestown or Salem, which was in Massachusetts, which of the two that you would choose. They both had a significant degree of problems, and in deciding which one you would move to, you had to kind of like weigh and compare which area would be better. Then further through that week, you took a look at some of the most famous drawings of Native Americans in the early colonial period to kind of like get an idea of what European impressions or interpretations of were of the Native Americans that they came across upon settlement. Now I want to move into week 2. I'll walk you quickly through the activities that are required for mastery and then take you to the PowerPoint presentation. With the first activity, it's called The English and the Natives. You'll watch a crash course episode, so hopefully you like John Green. In the episode, he will talk about early English settlement and the relationships that they had with Native Americans. You'll see in some instances those relationships were positive, but in most cases, the relationships over time soured as English settlement began to encroach upon native territory. You'll especially look at that within the context of Activity 7 here, as we examine some of the reactions that Native Americans had to the invasion of the Americas by the English. Moving further, I'll have you do an activity on U.S. geography, just kind of practicing. It's important for you to know where the 13 colonies were, and it's important for you to understand some U.S. geography. So you'll go to an outside website there where you'll do a couple like map activities, just identifying different locations in the United States. And then we're moving further on. You will examine colonial America and how it developed over time. There's another crash course episode there. And from there, you're going to do a document analysis on one of the most important pieces of American colonial history. It's called the Arbella Sermon. It was written by John Winthrop. He was the leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was the person who led the Great Migration to the American colonies from England. And in this sermon, he expresses one of the most famous statements in American and U.S. history, the city on the hill. This idea that the experiment in the colonies, or the experiment of what became America, would be one that everyone around the world would watch and hopefully over time emulate. So that's an important piece of American colonial history. You'll work through a document analysis in that activity, and then we'll move further from there and see how that sermon encouraged further migrations to the 13 British colonies. In the next activity, you'll compare colonial region. regions. And this activity actually corresponds to 11A, B, and C. So in 11A, B, and C, I'm using some Khan Academy lectures for you to gather information for the New England, the Middle, and the Southern colonies, because ultimately what you should be able to do by the end of this week is draw comparisons on them. And that's the whole purpose of the next PowerPoint that I'm going to take you to for the rest of this video. So let me take you there and let me see if I can, there we go. Okay, so the 13 British colonies, you already did this activity last week. If you had to go to one of them, which would you choose and why? I really only gave you the choice between Jamestown and Salem because as you will see in this presentation, there were other places that were probably a lot more desirable for settlement because of what they offered the people who settled there. Before we kind of get into that, it's important for me that you understand what was going on in England during the development of the different colonies. So what I've provided for you here is an outline of English royal succession from 1580 to 1820. These are the different British monarchs who reigned as the colonies developed, ending with George III, who reigned until 1820, but he's the famous king that led England during the American Revolution. So if you've ever read the Declaration of Independence and you've seen that list of grievances, he did this, he did that, the he that Thomas Jefferson was referring to is George III. So really English royalty and its experimentation with colonization begins with Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Under the reign of Elizabeth, there was a colonial settlement in Roanoke. It was a failed settlement. The people who were left there ended up disappearing. There is no trace of what happened to them. The person who left him there was Sir Walter Raleigh. He was actually called back to England because England was under attack by Spain. And when he returned to the colonies, the people were gone. As a result of that failed settlement, another colony was not undertaken by Elizabeth, but it didn't occur until James I came to power that Jamestown was settled. Jamestown eventually became a royal colony because of all of the trouble that was going on in terms of the success of the colony. You saw in last week's activity that the mortality rate in Jamestown was quite high because largely the focus was profit and people did not spend time growing food and developing other necessary means in order to live successfully in that colony. So Jamestown was a tough place to live, and because the English saw that as the case, they took control of the colony because it started out as a joint stock colony and sent a governor there to rule over that colony. After James I's reign, Charles I comes to power, and it was during Charles I's reign that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled. I mentioned John Winthrop before. There is also a period in English history where monarchy ended and Puritan rule reigned supreme under Oliver Cromwell. But he didn't rule England for very long, and it was during the Restoration when the monarchs came back in power under Charles II. After Charles II, James II came to power, and you can see as we move through this line of succession, what began as a more free colonial experiment became a situation where the colonies came under greater control by the English. Like right here I have Sir Edmund Andros came to rule over what was called the Dominion of New England. So a lot of these colonies at first in their settlement, like in the first 30 or 40 years, they developed and created a distinct American kind of like quality, but over time, the English took greater and greater control over them. That was the case with Governor Berkeley in Virginia. It came to be the case in New England with the Sir Edmund Andros. After James II, or I should say, James II's reign in England ended in 1688 when he abdicated the throne during what was called the Glorious Revolution, and William and Mary came to power. What happened under William and Mary? The colonial charters were restored, and the Dominion of New England was dissolved. That led to this kind of period in English colonial history called salutary neglect. So you can kind of see that over here on this side. And salutary neglect ended this strict kind of rule that the English put in place under the Navigation Acts, under Sir Edmund Andros, and it created a more loosened grip over the colonies. What then began to happen was a lot more self-government, and that American identity continued to form. There was a lot more increased settlement. Like if you look at the population of the colonies from 1607 all the way up until 1732, when the last colony was founded, the population grows incredibly over time. And that kind of takes us into the 1700s. When Queen Anne came to power, and then when the Hanover Kings come to power under George I and George III, the colonies get involved in a series of colonial wars. The British and the French were fighting over control in the region. Of course, you're familiar with the fact that the French controlled New France, which is present-day Canada. And leading up to the French and Indian War, there were multiple wars between the British and the French for control over the New England, over the colonies in the Americas. Okay, moving on from there, let's take a look at some of the different features of the colonies. I think most importantly are the economic activities. So if you take a look at this map, you can see the different colonial regions that I keep referring to: New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And over here you can see some of the economic activities that were important for them. Each of these maps kind of highlights the same, and you'll see these in the activity that you'll do this week. And then you'll begin to compare the different colonial regions. And that's why I like this map, because it kind of gives you a sense of what the landforms were like from region to region, the soil, the growing season, so on and so forth. So like if we go back to this map on economic activities, you'll see that the New England states were more industrial, while the southern and even the middle states were more agricultural. And that kind of is really the result of how rocky the land was in New England, how more fertile the land was, and how longer the growing season was in the South compared to the middle and the New England colonies. Moving on from there, it's important for you to be able to compare the colonial regions in all of these different areas. It's important for you to understand who the colonial founders were. And I created a little key down here, so it shows you like the purpose for their settlements. Some of them were commercial ventures, while others were religious in their foundation. Others were for living space or expansionary regions. And then yet others, like the colony of Georgia, that was a penal colony. So the British sent their prisoners there, and that was organized under a man named James Oglethorpe in 1733. So here's a list of all of the colonial founders and the different purposes or reasons for their settlement. So I'll kind of end there, but I'll also put this PowerPoint on the page because it goes further than just this. It goes into a lot of demographics for each of the colonial regions that you'll find valuable for your comparison.